Hold on one second. Devin, do you have to crinkle paper while we're recording? Please,
That is getting added.
running water,
That
doing
is
laundry,
getting
opening the
added.
doors, and
And like the bloopers reel at the end, like you have to crinkle paper right now. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Thoughts. My name is Keir,
My name is Hamish.
and today on the show we have Pavel Nitchovski, who is a PhD candidate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His main interests are in political and moral philosophy.
Today on the show, we talk about Buddhism. We give a brief overview of the main principles of Buddhism, and then we talk in depth about the self and ethics in Buddhism.
And so for today, here are some thoughts on Buddhism and the self. So just to get our listeners started, I was wondering if you could explain really what are the basic tenets of Buddhism? What does it mean when you study Buddhist philosophy?
What it means to study Buddhist philosophy is to engage Buddhism philosophically, right? A great place to start with that is usually is the founding kind of tenets of Buddhism, although I'm not sure that that's the best way to describe it, is to look at the Four Noble Truths that Gautama, the Buddha, delivers after reaching enlightenment to his disciples, right? The first of which is that there is suffering in the world. What that means is a fairly complicated thing, but it's very interesting by itself. The second is that there's an origin of suffering, and that this origin comes from the interdependence of causes on everything. The third is that there's a cessation of suffering. We can actually stop suffering in the future. And the fourth is that there is a path to cessation of suffering. So it's not something that just happens, but you can make it happen. And this path is usually what's known as the Eightfold Path.
Okay, just to go back to the second point there, and you said the interdependence of causes. What does that mean?
Yeah, so this is one of the more complicated questions, but and this also, again, is probably best explained through what Buddhists have come to call the 12-link chain of dependent origination. I'm not going to go through all the chains in here, but first, this is the truth concerned with the origin of suffering, right? So to understand why this origin of suffering works like this, I'll have to tell you a little bit about what suffering is under the Buddhist concept. So the first thing, you can split this up into three layers, essentially. The first is that there's the suffering of like bodily pain, toothaches, muscle cramps, headaches, all that kind of stuff that we generally classify as, pain, which is bad. The second one, though, is a much more subtle one. It has to do with the kind of psychological suffering of both desiring and getting what one desires, and the temporality of this kind of stuff. So you might think that you've experienced this when you think, everything would be great if only I got into the great university that I wanted to be in. If only I got tenure, right? And then you find out that, like, well, as soon as you get it, the joy, however long it lasts, is momentary, and sooner or later it kind of dissipates, and you're found both with the suffering of the desire having been satisfied and kind of, as it were, left, and also of the fact that another desire immediately replaces it. Right? It's the desire to go to a good grad school. It's the desire to, get a job. It's the desire to have a family. There's a never-ending kind of chain of desires, each of which causes suffering in this case, both by being not there yet, and then when it gets there, ending in this kind of disappointment. And this goes on throughout your whole life, right? There's a moment of suffering where you realize that this will be the game all the way until you're dead. And the final one is this kind of suffering, the existential suffering, which is supposed to be that, like, even existing itself is a kind of suffering. And part of this has to do with this notion that comes from the Vedic traditions from which Buddhism outgrows about karma and the karmic cycle. This is, again, a little more complicated, but the idea is that you might think, well, if I'm part of this karmic cycle and I'm going to be reborn and I'm going to do all this stuff, then there's no problem. Yeah, there's a bunch of, dissatisfied desires, but I'll die and then there'll be more, and maybe I can kind of stack things up. So the kind of suffering that comes from the realization that you're in this karmic cycle is the kind of realization that you're forever in a treadmill, that you're always trapped. You will always be reborn. You will always continue to have these desires, and there will be nothing that can stop it, right? So this is a very long way to getting to your initial question, which was what is the origination of suffering? Well, the idea is supposed to be like this. While you're living in, your regular life, you start forming certain volitions. The content of these volitions generates karmic residue, which keeps you born, keeps you within the cycle, and has you reborn again. Now, when you're reborn with a body. The body is sensitive to, external concepts of pleasure and pain. Those in turn create a notion of the self, an illusory notion of the self, which then starts to generate volitions, which once again create karmic residue.
What do you mean by volition? Sorry.
So volitions, there's certain desires that create karmic residue, right? Certain kind of desires will keep you going into the next life. Maybe these might be like wrath or anger or whatever.
I suppose karmic residues, are they sort of consequences of your volitions or your actions that affect your karma?
Yeah, think of the karmic laws as kind of like laws of nature, right? So they're definitely not anything that, or, you did something bad, therefore something bad's going to happen. It's not that. It's more like that there are laws that act on volitions to produce certain kinds of fruit in the next karmic cycle. So if you were a real bastard in this life, that will generate fruit that you're
Why are you looking at me?
Because you're a real bastard, that'll generate fruit that you'll have to reap in the next cycle of rebirth. But it's a cause and effect kind of situation in the way that dropping a bowling ball from the top of the roof will result in the bowling ball falling to the ground, right? Mm-hmm. But what's really important in all this stuff is that at the core of it is the fact that there's this notion that it's the self that creates these volitions, or the volitions depend on the self existing, which depends on having a body, which depends on having been reborn, which depends on previous volitions, right? So you see this kind of chain of interdependencies. This is what I was talking about earlier. But all of it kind of rests on this notion that you have been in a position where you have taken the illusion that you have a self, and that generates the stuff that then continues and keeps suffering occurring.
Okay, so the idea that the self is an illusion for the Buddha, why does the Buddha believe this? What are his arguments for this idea?
Yeah, so there's actually two arguments here, arguably. I believe this is in the Fire Sermon. But first of all, it helps to think of what the general idea of a self is, right? So what is a self? Well, the way that, it's being addressed in the discourse, and the way that, a lot of people might think about it, is that a self is something that is permanent and essential to a person, right? I mean, it's supposed to be that which stays the same as you go from being a baby to being a corpse. There's something that is essential there, and that is yourself. In that respect, it's a kind of metaphysical entity that has certain properties: permanence, essentiality, essence. Right. So a lot of people might think that, yeah, there is this kind of thing, right? Because, well, one reason you might think that something like this exists is because you can talk about my identity over time. I am the same person that you knew when you were living in North Carolina. Why is that? Well, I mean, for one thing, I look similar, but for another, even if, I cut off my beard and got a different haircut and wore contacts, you would still think that I'm the same. Even if I was in a horrible, chemical fire or something, and I didn't look anything like I did before, you still might think, well, no, that's the same Pavel that I talked to last year. How is that? Well, if there was a self, if there was this kind of essence in there, that would explain it. Furthermore, from your own perspective, you think, well, forget, across time, I know that, there's certain differentiating criteria right at this moment that makes me different from you, right? What could that be? Well, again, it might be some of the physical descriptions, but even if you created a carbon copy of me in a lab, I still think, well, no, there's a difference between me and my carbon copy. What is that? Well, it might be the self, right? So what is the argument for there not being a self? Well, the Buddha essentially gives a reduction argument here, right? So he says, look, let's reduce what a person is, and we can reduce it to what he calls the 5 skandhas, which are bundles. I think that's the literal translation, right? So the first bundle is supposed to be the rupa skandha, which is everything having to do with your body. And what are those? Well, it's, your blood, your skin, your bones, your eyes, everything that can be observed by anyone else. We can ask, okay, this is one of the things that makes up the person. Is this thing permanent? Is it essential? And the answer is no, right? Like, I don't look anything like I did when I was a baby. I've got teeth, I've got hair, I'm 4 times the same size that I was. There's not, you might very well be confused in what sense I am physically the same. Furthermore, like, every cell in your body has changed like something like 7 years. So there's nothing in your body that has remained from 7 years ago. You're physically a different thing. So it's not the case that your body's permanent, right? Then you have the other 4. After the Rupa skandhas are what are called the Namaskandhas, which are the ones of sensation, perception, volition, and consciousness. And these are, you can think of it as your subjective inner point of view. So these are all like the mental activities that are not physically observable, right? So you don't have access to my sensory experience of an object. I'm not going to go too much into those, but you can do the same story with those, right? So take the skandha of sensation, right? So this is about what's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. You can ask, well, is that one permanent? Well, no, that one is also conditioned on there being some object which is perceived, which produces something pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, right? Take away the needle in my leg, and after a while, the skandha of pain, the sensation of pain that's there, also disappears. It is not permanent. It is contingent on what causes were there. And you can do this with all the other ones, right? And at the end, the result is something like, well, look, none of the things that make up the person are essential or permanent. The self is supposed to be essential and permanent.
Okay,
There's
yeah,
nothing.
that makes sense. But so you're saying the body is not the self. My perceptions, that's not me. My thoughts, that's not myself. My feelings, that's not myself. Even consciousness, not really myself. But surely these are just all individual parts. And if you put them all together, well, then I can just say, well, then that's me. That is myself.
Yeah, so that might sound promising, right? But you might think like this, look, how is it that we have 5 impermanent things that when joined together become permanent or essential, right? What you have are the 5 skandhas. Collected, they are what we call the self. But there is no thing that is not these 5 things, none of which are impermanent, that exists over and above them, which is permanent, right? That would be, I think, the kind of Buddhist answer to this.
Okay, so I think I get it. But now I'm aware that obviously you were teaching this stuff to undergrads, and I'm imagining these undergrads probably had something to say about the Buddha's idea that there was no such thing as the self. What were they saying?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and as you can tell, the argument that is proposed here is not one that's like, it grates against your intuitions, right? It grates against what you normally think. So what problems did they have? I mean, I think there were 2 really big problems. One is that they couldn't imagine what it would mean from a first person perspective not to have a self. I think a lot of folks kind of struggled with, how would I live at all if this thing wasn't there? The answer to that is it's never been there. So it's never, the absence of it does not mean that your life would change differently. Phenomenologically, it might have some upshots if you are now no longer thinking in terms of me and myself and how this thing progresses through life. But the other thing that people really struggled with was how to make, well, whether life would be meaningful without the self. A lot of people were worried that if we get rid of this concept, life would just stop being meaningful.
That makes sense to me, that argument. Like, how can an individual have meaning in their life if there is no individual to have meaning?
Right. Okay. What is it that kind of pushes you towards that line of thinking?
It just seems like an intuition. You know what I mean? I feel if I want to find a purpose in life, even the way that I've structured that is I've said, I want to find a purpose. If I've got no I to find a purpose, I struggle to view a life which would have meaning and purpose.
Yeah, good question. I mean, this is one of, so one of the things that Keir said, for example, was, like, even when I present this, grammatically, I present it as I have meaning. How can I have meaning if the I doesn't refer to anything, right? So that's one way that you might think, well, meaning in life just has to be intelligibility or something. Meaning in life, there's another way in which you might think that, no, it has to be like substantial, purposeful meaning, in the same way that you might think, a life spent
Counting blades of grass, that's a good one.
counting blades of grass, or, getting as stoned as possible and playing FIFA all day. It might be a pleasant life, but we might still think, well, that's not a meaningful life, right? So there's lots of different things, but whatever it is that we're talking about having meaning, how is it that, like, if there's no me there, how can me have a meaning? How can I have my life have a meaning if there's no my life? And I think this is what Keir, what you were pushing at.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a kind of conciliatory attitude one can take here, where it says, like, look, the person doesn't disappear, right? So when we say that there is no self, it's not that, like, Keir is gone, right? Or Hamish is gone. It's not that. I mean, if that was the case, then, like, that's a non-starter. You're here, right? What's being removed is the idea that what you are is intimately and essentially tied to this metaphysical thing, which is essential or impermanent, right? So what a lot of Buddhists say is that the person remains,
Okay.
but the person is not a self. What is the person? Well, the person is this causally connected stream of skandhas, none of which are permanent. Think of it as like streams in a river or threads in a fabric that still constitutes something. It's not hollow. It's not an emptiness in the absence of existence. It is an emptiness in the absence of essential fundamentality there. So no, there is a you there. The you is not what you thought it was. The you is not this permanent thing. The you of the person is this constant flux of things that is always changing.
So that in itself is also a very interesting question to talk about. One thing that springs into my mind that's intimately connected with the self is ethics, right? How does one's ethics change? How is Buddhist ethics different from Western ethics when Western ethics has a clear notion of the self?
Yeah, good. So one of the ways that I like to look at all different kind of ethical theories is that they all kind of start with a central problem or a central question. So a lot of Western ethics that we're used to start with the question of what is the right thing to do, or what do I need to do? And that implies a certain kind of, in order to be able to answer that question, you have to address some of the underlying assumptions about there being an I, there being a right action. But setting that aside, what this shows us is that we're going to get an ethics that looks a lot at duties, obligations, rightness, wrongness, this kind of stuff. Now, there's another Western tradition, that of virtue ethics, which isn't exclusively Western. It appears in classical Chinese philosophy as well, which starts by asking, what does it mean to live a good life? Now, this is a very roundabout way of saying that for Buddhism, the question starts with neither of these questions, or the answer to what the ethics is, but it starts with the question of how can we end suffering? And that has a very interesting answer, right? So what the answer that we're given is that we end suffering by getting rid of the illusion of the self and understanding what the nature of reality is, right? So it's less concerned with, again, what kind of character do you need to cultivate, although that will fall out of the answer of, well, you need to have the kind of character that will allow you to get rid of the illusion. So you have to, behave in a certain way and pick up certain characteristics. And likewise, solving, this problem will require that you act and don't act in a certain way. And given that suffering is bad, it will require the elimination of suffering. But it's also not, again, focused on the acts either. So what is it focused on? Well, it's focused on, and this is from the philosopher Jay Garfield's, I really like his explanation of this. It's focused on a phenomenological shift, right? So the ethics of Buddhism falls out of how one shifts their perception to the outside world. And you can see how that fits in, right? So if at the core I'm supposed to get rid of the illusion, then what I have to do is stop acting or thinking of myself phenomenologically from my own perspective as being a thing that is a self that relates with other selves and things like that. What follows from that? Well, it follows that, whenever I see suffering, I don't think of this in terms of like, well, this is my suffering or someone else's suffering. I see it just as suffering that exists, that is bad and must be eliminated. Likewise, when I see joy in others, it's not their joy and my joy. It is just joy that is good. Right? So one of the things that Buddhism encourages is taking pleasure in the joys of other people. Empathy, a lot of these things that are familiar, but again, we get to from an entirely different perspective.
Fantastic.
Well, yeah, that is fantastic. Well, listen, we should probably end the conversation here, but thank you so much, Pavel, for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's been a really interesting conversation.
Thank you very much for tuning in to another episode of Thoughts. We'll see you next week.